Welcome back to Continuing the Conversation, where we bring you authentic AI insights. First, I want to thank everyone who engaged with our recent episode on the entry level apocalypse. The comments, discussions, and passionate responses showed us that we're hitting on something people really care about. You're not just watching, you're thinking, questioning, and wrestling with these ideas. That's exactly what we had hoped for. One theme that kept coming up in your responses was the question, if AI is eliminating traditional career paths, what skills actually matter? And Rob, you've been saying something that initially sounded counterintuitive. EQ might be the new IQ as AI muscles into the white collar work. This isn't about being touchy-feely. This is about something much more strategic and essential for survival in an AI-dominated workplace. I'm your host, Shalene Martin, AI enthusiast, business strategist, and co-founder of Revenue Pulse Advisors. I work with individuals and companies to unlock practical, powerful ways to use AI every day in life and work. Joining me today is my friend, Rob, the CEO of CharmIQ. Rob, welcome back. And let's be honest, when you say emotional intelligence, people immediately think you're advocating for feelings over facts. Emotions should drive decisions, but you're arguing for something completely different. Can you clarify what you actually mean by EQ in the AI age?
Thanks, Shalene. This one was a really interesting question and a whole series of dialogue back and forth that we had from one of our previous episodes. And to say what Shalene said earlier, thank you so much for engaging with us. We only know what's in our own heads. And I think that's one of the things we're going to get into here in this discussion is, you can only see the world through your own eyes. You need the interaction and responses from other people to see the world through their eye. And let's talk a little bit about emotional intelligence. We hear about EQ and they try to match it with IQ. So rather than being EI, which is what it stands for, emotional intelligence, it's EQ. So what is that? When we're talking about emotional intelligence, what we're just simply saying is that emotions are part of all of us. We have all of them. Not every decision that we make is a purely logical, rational decision. There are factors that come into play, emotional factors. How do you feel? How did you intrinsically, how did you respond to something? One of the things I've said many times in this podcast is I grew up the child of a chronic worrier. And I took on all of these responses that I'll admit never felt right to me. So not only would a situation come up and then my mother would worry and freak out, and then I would feel that because that's how you learn, right? You learn from your parents. So these situations and I would go, okay, I need to freak out in this situation. But inside I'd be like, well, why am I freaking out? Like what? And I see, weird decisions being made. And I'm like, well, but this doesn't make sense. Like, so what I want to say with all of this is a lot of the responses that we have are kind of given down to us. They come from our social circle. They come from our family and these things. And they may not be the things that we're feeling, but they're still there. We still have those responses. And all of those things I'm talking about, those are all emotions. Those are things that you feel in response to these things. So somebody starts yelling at you. You may feel angry. You may feel hurt. You may feel confused. You may feel like all of these things. And if you remove the emotion from it and you look at just the rational, logical response based on like this situation, what should happen, that is typically different than the response that you have when you apply the emotions onto them. And if we think back, your body's trained to react a certain way so that certain things happen so that you can respond quickly. Like a tiger comes jumping out at you, you should feel scared because that way all of the other processing that happens in your brain should shut down and you should focus on like getting yourself to safety, or somebody around you, a loved one is in danger and so forth. And again, trying to understand all of this and us understand that we have these emotions and we have these feelings. That's the emotion side. Mm-hmm. So what's the intelligence side of the emotional intelligence? If you search on the internet, there's these kind of 4 key skills that come along with emotional intelligence. Like one of the first ones is to recognize the fact that you have emotional responses to things. Like in my case, when I'd be taking tests in college, I would go into this freak out mode. Even though I knew what I was doing, I knew how to take the test because I learned this growing up, that I should be freaked out. And so now I'm dealing with the freaked outness along with trying to perform perform on an exam, that self-awareness of myself, just trying to see, well, what is this? Why am I feeling this? Is it helping me or hindering, and all these things? So self-awareness is really the first one. Self-regulation is another one, which is once you recognize something that happens, you have to see whether or not you can regulate it. Like, can you control that? One is to say, like, could you control your emotions? And what I'm almost saying is something completely different, which is to recognize the fact that the emotions can be controlled, that you do have some agency over these things. So again, going back to my personal story of when I would go into a stressful situation and freak out mode, and I would like, can I do something about this? Am I even capable? And you have to make the decision as to whether you should. The other two is to recognize that because we have these emotions, and because, again, we have the ability to move them up and down and regulate them and so forth, we have to also recognize that these things can exist in others, and that other people may be experiencing these same things. So again, in a test situation, somebody might see that I'm all freaked out, and to recognize that in me and be like, well, holy cow, man, take a step back, take a deep breath, and things like that. So, and then the last one's really about social skills, which is once you recognize you may have them, you can control them, others might have them. The next step is, well, how do you communicate between people and say like, hey, I do see that you're in a situation, or a lot of us are really not good with these things. And somebody's angry, you'll be angry back at them rather than saying like, hey, wait, I don't need to be angry in this situation because you're angry. And in fact, that may actually make it worse. Like maybe it might be better if I go into this situation just trying to understand why you're angry. And it could just mean like they're having a bad day. Like I don't need to compound that. And again, my hope through this exercise was to say that there's different aspects and we can start to really kind of focus on these different pieces. And then again, by thinking about them, and this is that intelligence, right? Is like by us simply having this discussion, we've become more emotionally intelligent about these things.
Yes, I think, and you hit on something. So just being aware, right? Just having that awareness going into any situation, whether it's a simple change or a big change, just being aware of people's emotions and not just the strategic outlook or the change that you're looking to implement. So let's get specific. You mentioned before that any major business challenge, the logical solution is usually pretty obvious, right? But people don't adopt it, right? For whatever reason, like it's right there in front of you. It's sitting on the desk. It's sitting on the page. But there's something that kind of takes over a human in terms of adopting that logical solution. So can you walk us through some examples of how some of the things we were just talking about, fear, status anxiety, and identity threats derail even the most brilliant, simple strategies that are right in front of us?
This one is a great question. This is a great thing to talk about. So one of the things that everyone talks about is, if we get these super intelligent AIs, they can help us with climate change. They can help us with gun control, or like, pick your favorite topic that you want to talk about. And what's interesting is that almost implies that just because we have a solution, that means we'd implement it. We have lots of potential solutions to climate change right now. Yes. The reason that we don't make those decisions tends to be emotional things. Like we have beliefs in certain approaches. We believe these things. Like, again, it's not the lack of solutions that prevents us from doing things. So, again, to what I was saying, AI may not need to provide us with a new answer to climate change, because we have actually lots of answers to climate change. We just choose to not do them because they're challenging, or something else is going on with those things. One of the challenges that we have in business is working with people. As we just talked about in terms of emotional intelligence and so forth, is people are emotional beings. Yes. We respond to certain things in certain ways. Every time I see a car commercial, I'll admit it drives me absolutely bananas, because when you actually step back and you look at what they're trying to do, is they're trying to associate like nationalism and pride and bravado with a car. And when you just like kind of step back and you think about that, it's just like, wow, that's really weird. So again, what's bizarre, and I'll admit my hatred of car commercials actually comes from my father's hatred of car commercials. Because he would always say that, like every time a car commercial came on, he's like, what does a car have to do with like how I'm feeling today? Like, I don't understand. And so I have that same thing now. And so, I always look at these and I look at, again, like what does emotion and applying emotion to a situation do? And when you think about like almost all marketing is driven around the emotional side. It's not about a rational choice. This is cheaper than that, and so forth. Like, you look at Apple products, for example, they're typically not the cheapest. They're not necessarily always the best. But, once you build a brand identity around things, once you create an emotional response to these things,
Yeah.
well, and they know that actually has higher precedence in terms of your decision-making ability. So just thinking about all of the different similar types of examples, you realize that just because you have the right answers, that emotion gets involved in these things. And again, the emotional intelligence of understanding the motivations of people trying to make these decisions. Are they trying to protect their job? Are they worried about their future? Are they worried about their current status level and job and so forth? And again, how do those affect the decision-making process? Well, just because a logical solution is the right one, you may still have to go after an emotional understanding of what the person needs and what would give them, like, what are their goals in this thing? It might not just be to save money. It might be something else. Again, they're more interested in, saving their position, or they're vying for a new position and so forth. So those are those interesting things that it's not always the right answer. So take, for example, something Shalene and I have been saying throughout this podcast for months now, which is, for reasons we can't understand, there's this emotional attachment to ChatGPT, even though there are better solutions out there. I'm going to raise my hand and say, we believe we have another one of them, but it doesn't even mean us. It just means there's other solutions, and people make an emotional response, and a really visceral. We will get this in some communities where we'll suggest something else, and they're like, well, but it can't be ChatGPT and all these other things. And it's just like, why would you have, especially now when something is nascent and growing, why would you have such a weird brand affinity to a thing? Like, that is counter to everything that you should be doing right now, which is effectively not having any allegiance to anything whatsoever, because it's all changing so quickly and growing. But again, for some reason, people have such a strong brand affinity to it. And again, that is only an emotional response. Like, there can be, because you can prove through metrics and through other things that there are better models in certain cases for certain things. So, like, why would you be tied to that? So, again, I'm just trying to bring up all these different things. Again, not saying somebody's right, not saying somebody's wrong, not saying this approach is wrong. But again, the whole point of emotional intelligence is to understand that there are these decisions that get made for reasons that may not just be purely logical. And how do you navigate that landscape when that is true?
Yeah, and I think human reactions, people get really passionate. I'm a passionate person, and that passion works most of the time for me. But I think humans are programmed. They are machine-like at times. But the human reactions, right, are so, because we all react differently. We all have different personalities of what we bring to the table. Some of us are logical, some of us are emotional, right? So here's what's interesting, and this is something we've been talking about for months and we'll continue to talk about for months. As AI gets better at analytical work, the human variables become even more important, right? So when the machine can crunch numbers better than the analysts and write reports better than a junior staff writer, what's left, right, is really navigating what you were just talking about, is navigating the messy human reactions to the change, to the implementations, right? So how does AI amplify the importance of emotional intelligence? And what does it mean for leaders going through and navigating all of this?
Those are great questions. What's really fascinating about this, though, and there's been studies on this, which is that some models are actually more emotionally intelligent than their human counterparts. There was actually some studies with doctors that said, not only were the results, the diagnostics out of the LLMs better, but the emotional response and the understanding of the human was better. And I'll just admit that there were also terrible counterexamples where people have been starting to use LLMs for psychological things when they're clearly not ready to perform those things. So as always, there's a whole gamut of things going on here. But the question around what is this going to highlight more and more of our need to understand our own emotional intelligence, and what does that mean? And I would just say that that's what I'm finding fascinating out of this is, as we've mentioned now in a few episodes, we've always been the top of the intelligence heap. And as these machines get more and more and start chipping away at that, it might be that we just have to become the thing that might be the more human thing that we end up doing is just that, the human thing, the emotional side, the understanding of humans and so forth. And I would just, my guess is that even if we have machines that are more empathetic and so forth, we're still going to want that human human bond that we get by just sitting down, the touch, the understanding, the look in the eye, and those things. So I would say we all can't read the future at this point. But the fact that we're not only having this discussion, we're supposed to be ostensibly talking about AI, but we're talking about emotions at this time,
Mhm.
simply because I think we're going to go through this very emotional time. And we're already going through an emotional time. And I think all of the social media and things like that has actually driven more distance between people and less understanding. And it's easier to just sometimes fire from the hip and be like, it doesn't matter, rather than if you don't do that in front of people and so forth. So again, what I think this is really highlighting is the need for us to go back to some of the basics of
Yes.
just really understanding what it means to be a good human being and to understand each other and to listen to each other. By now, the only things that we had to really compare ourselves against in a really weird way, especially post-COVID, a lot of people had dogs and companions and things like that
Mhm.
non-human companions. And, that's been on the rise as well. Like there's clearly a need for people to have this emotional connection. And again, I think that that's like super positive, that if there's something that comes about that helps us become better, as Shalene always says, better versions of ourselves, like that's great. If we lose not lose intelligence, but again, if we lose the top rung of the winner circle for against AI in terms of intelligence, but we become better humans because we understand and spend
Yeah.
more time together and so forth, I think that would be absolutely amazing out of the backside of this.
Yeah, I think so too. I think the intelligence part is definitely being challenged on the human side, but the emotional part we really own. And the emotional part is maybe not what some of us have been really exercising and building and being aware of, right? So as we're talking about, EQ is the new IQ, right? Because the machines are proving time and time again that they're leveling up. What are some of the practical capabilities becoming incredibly valuable as AI handles more of the analytics and intelligence heavy lifting? What are us as humans? What should we be going to our emotional gym and exercising or waking up, if you will?
That is brilliant. We should really leverage that, the emotional gym, because we do things for our physical body, right? Like we're
Mhm.
constantly talking about going to the gym and eating healthy and so forth, but we really don't talk about our emotional and psychological health. And I think like that is going to have to become more and more prevalent, even if we stop with the AI today, like even if like it got no smarter, it's still disruptive and we still have not incorporated it into our lives holistically. Like literally there's no way. It's just been happening so fast.
Yeah.
So that's why I keep saying that EQ is the new IQ, because I think I'm not saying that one should replace another. I'm not saying anything else. I went to school in the 70s and 80s, and there was no class that we had on like understanding other human beings. Like we
Right.
had, we had standardized tests, we had like all of this stuff, but there was no class that I went through that's like relationship 101. Like, what do I do when my partner's having a bad day? like
Right.
just simple basic things. That's what this causes. If this reflection on intelligence causes us to go the other way and say, well, where's the emotional side of this? How do we think about whether it's cultural norms or whether it's societal norms or whether it's even workplace norms? Like, what do we do with those things? How do we understand them? How do they all come together? How do we look at them and how do we raise our EQ? How do we go to that emotional gym and that EQ gym? And like, what exercises should we do on a daily basis? I've just given you some starter things, which is
Yeah.
to first recognize that we all have emotions, to recognize the fact that there are ways to change them. And I'm not saying that if you're an angry person, you shouldn't be angry. Like, that's not my place to say those
Right.
things. What I'm saying is you have a choice. And sometimes we get funneled into these things and these things get imposed upon us. And it takes time and it takes emotional gym time for us to go like, well, hey, what can I do to do these things? Maybe it's affecting my blood pressure. Maybe it's affecting, maybe I get migraines or something because like I'm going through these stressful times. Like I need to understand how these emotions affect me and affect people around me.
Yeah, and I think that's it. The affecting, so a lot of us and some of us have been like, we think about ourselves a lot, right? People have therapists or they have help groups or they have social circles that are like therapists, right? Sounding boards, but it's usually about the person, right? How do
Mhm.
I feel? How does this make me feel? How am I feeling? How do I cope, right? So, but this sounds like a completely different skill set or an added skill set than what most people think of as emotional intelligence, right? So, how do we actually develop a strategic understanding of human behavior, not just the me, not just the I, but other humans that are involved? So, I'm a CEO of a company, or I'm, working with a CEO of a company, and we're talking about AI implementation and integrating AI into our minimum daily requirements and using what these people call tools, but they're not tools. So, how do we understand human behavior, and what are some practical steps for building what you call human systems logic, right? Not just focused on the I, but the others that are being affected by the change.
Totally. What's so interesting, if there's blind spots that we have, if there are taboos that we have, especially here in America, we don't talk about emotions. We don't talk about how we're feeling. We don't talk about in productive ways. Like there's definitely, we complain a lot. If there's one thing that we do a lot is just like complain about work, complain about these things. And those aren't necessarily the best ways to deal with these things. And I'm not saying the complete opposite, which is if you had a bad day at work, don't just stuff it down and ignore it.
Right.
There are techniques to like look at these things. We've already spent a ton of time here just talking about what is emotional intelligence. To go through another level is another podcast on this. But I do just want to say that these things are understood. There are approaches to looking at these things. There are classes to take. You can talk to your neighborhood friendly LLM about these things and say, like, what are the things that I can do and how can I understand them? And just there's some book learning you can do about these things. And there's some neighborhood learning where you can talk to friends and family about the techniques that they use about these things. And it's all about recognizing what you feel and trying to apply that empathy. As I always say, put your empathy hat on and say, well, if I had these feelings, other people may have these feelings. And in fact, they may have feelings that I don't have. And I should understand, especially in partners and coworkers and things that are close in your circle, you should understand how they affect each other. And again, we tend to not talk about those. They tend to be taboo, but it's very uncommon that if you approach this in an open and understanding way, that you can't talk to other people in the workplace or even in your family units, that you can't just sit and talk and even starting to talk about the emotions and how they manifest and what you can do. And just sometimes just simply starting that conversation is a relief. And it's an emotional release. So I would just say, even with AI, we always say starting. And I would say the same thing on your emotional intelligence side. We're going to be going through a whole lot of change. We just had Microsoft say they're going to lay off 9,000 more workers. And I'm trying to not be a doomer on this stuff, but I think that these are just the days are starting. This is going to be the norm as we shift through and start to understand this new world that we're entering into. And I think we're all going to need to be there for each other and understand what each other is feeling and be okay to sometimes not be okay. Yeah. I know that's a thing that was really hard for me to do in my family unit, is like you always had to put a smile on. You always had to be whatever. And sometimes it's okay to not be okay. And again, that's all part of the emotional tool set.
Yes. So you mentioned Microsoft. We know Amazon's doing a bunch of stuff with robots in their warehouses, and lots of companies laying off at certain levels because the machines are doing a great job. Right. So when we're thinking about these advancements continuing, what are some of the emotional intelligence career changes and strategies we can be focusing on? Like, you look at everyone's LinkedIn and it's like, I have all these skills and I can do all these spreadsheets. It's just like skills. I don't ever really see, I mean, maybe a few, and I know I do it because I'm proud of my emotional intelligence, and I think it adds great value to organizations. What are some things that our listeners can be doing to remain valuable in an AI augmented workplace?
Yeah, this is a great question, because as the machines start to chisel away at where we were the leader, again, in intelligence, like where can we shine? Yes. And how do you differentiate yourself between your other workers? Because we're getting to a place where you're not going to be necessarily hired for your skills. You may be hired specifically for very nuanced, practical things. Like, you had this experience in here and we need to replicate that. But, in terms of what you just said, your ability to go into a worksheet and do a pivot table probably ain't going to be the thing you put on your resume much longer.
Right.
Whereas I think what you said is exactly right. Like people who are much more emotionally available and emotionally understanding of other people, those are the people that are going to shine in days like today. Are you going to be the person that's there and is helping the team and is understanding them and helping them through the hard times and so forth? Because again, I think that we're going to see more of those rather than less of them in the near future. Having these soft skills, these emotional intelligence skills, I think are going to start to become more paramount.
Yes.
Given two people of equal intelligence, the one that's able to like read the room better, which again is really just another statement for emotional intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
That skill is going to become paramount in these days. Yeah, wouldn't it be a funny day where all of a sudden your emotional skills, your ratings, I always think back to my youth and my Dungeons and Dragons days where you would roll for hit points and things like that. But nowadays you want to roll for empathy and you want to roll for understanding and you want high
Yes.
scores there.
Yes, right? It is. The emotional intelligence means so much more in this age, and it's going to be incredibly more important going forward. So, Rob, this has been incredibly clarifying and eye opening. And I guarantee you, we're going to have more comments and discussions from our listeners and viewers.
I hope so.
You've completely reframed the emotional intelligence, what it means in this AI age. And it's not about being soft. It's not about prioritizing feelings. It's about being strategically intelligent about the most unpredictable variable in any system, which is human behavior. So, for everyone watching, this isn't just about being nicer to people, although that helps. It's about developing crucial competitive advantage. Years ago, when I was training and educating sales leaders on change management, I often said to the leaders, like, be cognizant of how your teams are going to react. And to the teams, I would say, flex your style. Right? Understand how you're feeling and flex your style if you want to get more from your boss or more from your teammates. It's an important skill and muscle to have. So, as AI handles more of the analytical work, your ability to understand, predict, and navigate human psychology becomes so much more valuable. So thank you again for all your engagement in our recent episodes. We loved it. We appreciate it. It gets us excited. So keep the comments and discussions coming. They help us shape these conversations and episodes and dig deeper. The links to Charm IQ are below, and join us next time for more authentic AI insights as we continue to explore to how this rapidly evolving landscape affects us all. So Rob, thank you for helping us understand why the future belongs to those who can decode the human equation. And before we close, I want to give a little AI tip, especially for those of you building relationships with AI, like we talked about last week. Maybe try asking your AI when you're working through a problem, what might my team or my boss or someone feel anxious or resistant about during this process of change? Even if they don't say it out loud, work with your AI, like Rob alluded to earlier, and ask and work with them to work out those feelings. Because sometimes the smartest move isn't just solving the problem, it's anticipating the feeling behind it. So thanks for continuing the conversation with us. Stay smart and stay human. See you next week.